and want to make sure we leave everyone's enough time to engage with us today. Thank you, and welcome to the Hatch Center's first Religious Liberty Symposium. By way of introduction, my name is Matt Sangren. I'm the Senator's former Chief of Staff and currently the Executive Director of the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation. I know I speak for everyone at the Foundation when I say it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for coming here. We're grateful to be joined by leaders of many faiths, including rabbis. We just had 2 apostles, pastors, and elders. And so this is really quite an amazing opportunity. I'd also like to recognize Philip Klinger, the Vice Chair of the University of Utah's Board of Trustees, Kim C. Gardner, a board member of the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation, and A. Scott Anderson, the Foundation's chairman. Likewise, I'd like to thank the clergy, community leaders, and policymakers who are with us today or who will soon be joining us. I wish we could recognize each of you, but in the interest of time, let me simply say this. Thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting the cause of religious liberty and freedom. It's only fitting that the namesake of the Foundation is also with us today, Senator Orrin G. Hatch himself. We're honored by his presence. For those who may not know, Senator Hatch has done more than any legislator alive to advance the cause of religious liberty. And that's no exaggeration. With 42 years of public service, he passed more than 750 bills into law. But his proudest achievement was the seminal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a bill he co-authored with the late Senator Ted Kennedy. This law prohibits substantial government burdens on the free exercise of religion, allowing all Americans to live, work, and worship in accordance with their deeply held personal beliefs. RFRA is arguably the most important piece of religious liberty legislation of the last century, and we have Senator Hatch to thank for it. Senator Hatch was also instrumental in defending religious freedom when he served on the Senate Judiciary Committee. As one of the committee's longest-serving members in American history, Senator Hatch participated in the confirmation of more than half of all federal judges who have ever served. The senator's primary consideration when evaluating the fitness of any judicial nominee was always his or her commitment to upholding the Constitution, including the protection of religious liberties it enshrines. Senator Hatch's defense of religious liberty was animated by the belief that an attack on one religion is an attack on all. And it's that very same belief that brings us together today. Whether you wear a mezuzah or go to a mosque, whether you follow Buddha or the Bible, you are here because you believe the rights of conscience are sacred and immutable. You are here because you believe that religious freedom is not just one right among many, but the first and most important. It is the liberty that makes all other liberties possible. It is the basis of freedom itself. While we may hold different views on religion, we are all united on religious liberty. Protecting this foundational freedom is essential to the future of our republic. That's why we've brought together people of various faiths and political backgrounds for today's symposium. Our purpose is to create a coalition of common interest to preserve this precious freedom for future generations. And we've got quite the lineup of speakers to show us how we can achieve this goal. Without taking too much more time, let me give you a brief overview of today's program. Following my remarks, Scott Anderson will introduce our first speaker, Baroness Emma Nicholson of Winterbourne and a member of the UK House of Lords. We're so grateful you're here with us. She will be followed by Brent Hatch, who will introduce BYU law professor and director of International Center for Law and Religion Studies, Brett Scharffs. Welcome, Brett. Afterwards, Senator Hatch will introduce our keynote speaker, Leonard Leo, the Executive Vice President of the Federalist Society, and we are honored to have him here with us. Once Mr. Leo has concluded his remarks, we'll take a quick break before convening our Interfaith Roundtable. I'll now turn the time over to our next speaker, Scott Anderson.
Well, thanks, Matt. And Senator Hatch, we are so pleased to be here, and we are so pleased that you have set up this Hatch Center and Foundation so that your voice and your example can continue to inspire us and help us find the right way. So it's a pleasure to be here today. It's my honor to introduce the Baroness Emma Nicholson of Winterbourne. Baroness Nicholson has traveled more than 4,000 miles to be with us today. She arrived in about 12:30 a.m. this morning from London, and so we are incredibly fortunate that she would come and travel to be here. The Baroness is committed, as she says, by heart and by head to public service. She has said, I work to fulfill that goal through whatever opportunity engages and which emerges, which gives me the potential to do good things for the good of others, anywhere, at any time. The Baroness is a peer of the British realm and a member of the UK House of Lords. In the House of Lords, she sits as a conservative on the government's benches. She's a towering figure in British politics, having served previously in the House of Commons and in the European Parliament. Today, she is the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Iraq and other countries in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. I think of the Baroness as the UK counterpart to Senator Hatch. Both garner respect from the left and from the right. Both have extensive experience in public service, and both are passionate defenders of religious freedom. Except that I have to say, Senator, that the Baroness does it with a little extra dash of British charm and sophistication. But we are so grateful that the Baroness could join us this morning. She brings to our conversation not only a refined English accent, but a much-needed international perspective on religious liberty issues. The Baroness is the founder and chairperson of the Amar International Charitable Foundation, a charity that is dedicated to delivering services to refugees, internally displaced persons, and other underserved populations, especially women and children. She's seen up close and personal how crackdowns on religious freedom can lead to the humanitarian crises we've seen across the Middle East and in Europe. The Baroness is a finalist for the Global Religious Freedom Award from the RFB Foundation, and she also received an honorary doctorate degree from BYU in 2007 for her charity and humanitarian work around the globe. Her remarks today are inspired in part by the extensive work she has done with refugees all over the world. We're so honored to have someone of her high office as our very first speaker. So help me welcome the Baroness Emma Nicholson.
Very wicked of you. Dear colleagues and friends, it's an enormous honor to be here today. I had the great privilege of meeting the Senator just very briefly in his office about 18 months ago. And of course, like everyone else who knows him, I was immediately struck by his enormous sense of authority combined with compassion. It's a very rare combination, and he has the power, but he also has the sensitivity and the heart to go with the proper exercise of power. That's not so usual in politics. Most of us politicians have huge ambitions and tend to leave our hearts somewhere at the back door, but you haven't. You've managed to keep everything together. It was a pleasure to meet you so briefly in Congress about 18 months ago, and I'm so excited to be in your important foundation. And for that, of course, I have to thank Scott and Jesseline, who popped in on our AMA office very recently And it's a very small office, and you sat very comfortably and very nobly in a situation of extreme discomfort. And you were really both very wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. And I had no idea that you were going to honour us by inviting me to join you in this powerfully important seminar. Thank you to Jesseline, too. It was wonderful to have you both. And of course, we met you through Stan and Joyce Parish, and I can't see, where's Stan gone? Exactly. Now, wicked Stan sitting at the back, where he should be sitting at the front. I know. Stan is a really great man, and so is his wife, Joyce. Sister Parish, Sister Joyce, is absolutely fantastic. We missed them in London. They were the most amazing pair for the church in London, covering the whole of Europe. Luckily, we managed to make London the most interesting spot in Europe, so we had the great joy of seeing and working together a very great deal indeed. Thank you so much, Stan, for the introduction to Scott and to Jesseline. We've already had a word with Elder Holland. I'm sure he shouldn't have popped in, but he did, and also with Elder Belder, and both of them have gone away as I told them to go and do some work. But it is particularly lovely to be able to see the Free family. Thank you all so much. And I welcomed a friend of Kathy's only 2 days ago who was passing through London on her way to a big seminar in Oxford. So we too have become friends. We don't yet have Jim Olsen here, but I think he's coming pretty quickly because he is, of course, the introducer of myself and all of us in the Amar Foundation. May I take the opportunity to introduce Andrew Methven and Chris Frost with me, who are the great men of Amar in London, and thank them for coming as well at such short notice. Our friendship, yours and mine, between the church and myself and my colleagues and friends, has grown very steadily over a 9-year period. It's been ever expanding. I first of all got maybe to know Sharon Eubank, and now that has developed and developed and developed until the other day we had a big conference in Baghdad, and we had some of you there, including Brett. It was absolutely wonderful. And it expanded with public and private activities. I would say this friendship has broadened and deepened, and it has built trust and confidence in each other's motives, in each other's commitment, and in each other's standards of behavior and practice of our lives. Essentially, I would say that we all enjoy being together. And I've been thinking, what is the magic thread that has built up so fast? 9 years is just a fraction of time in human life. What is the magic thread? I think the magic thread is philanthropy. And I'm using that word in the old-fashioned sense of Greek, philos and anthropos, the love of mankind. I think we share that common belief, an unselfish love of mankind, which is generally expressed free from personal bias in public service. And like the senator, I am a public servant. And thinking further, I think that the bluebird of happiness that we all chase doesn't come when she's called. She chooses her own flight path. She decides where to roost. She decides who to come and say hello to. And I'm reminded that she comes to us when we're serving other people. You do it through the church. I work not just as an Anglican, but as a member of the Amar Foundation, and of a secondary body, which I formed maybe about a decade, 10 years later, 20 years later, which is called the Iraq-Britain Business Council, another charity, because once you have someone healthy and educated, it came to me to recognize what are they then going to do. So this is designed for jobs and futures. And I've just come from a massive conference of the Iraq-Britain Business Council, which we held in Mansion House, which is the seat of the Lord Mayor of the City of London. And for the first ever time, we were able to bring in 150 important and honest and decent Iraqi businesses, and we matched them with British and American and some European businesses, so at last we can offer jobs and futures. This little organization, again, a not-for-profit and a charity, is done through public service, and it has created hundreds of thousands of jobs in the decade in which it has been working. The Ammar Foundation, with which we have partnered very, very happily, LDS, was founded after I found a small boy, 46% third-degree burn down his front, who'd been brought over the border of Iraq into Iran, just on the border, during the huge, huge uprisings against Saddam Hussein, when your troops and our troops, including Andrew, pushed Saddam's troops out of the unfortunate citizens of Kuwait. I found this little boy, and he was in the most terrible state, clearly dying, and I was begged by the local population to take him back to England to save his life. I approached the Charity Commission, because I can't do that alone. You know, you can't just do that sort of thing. And they said, you can't set up a charity for a single boy. So we called it Ammar, after him. But in fact, since then, we have delivered, in 26 years, we've now delivered over 10.5 million medical consultations and about 500,000 lessons and a huge amount of training, all at a total on-cost of 9.8% overhead costs. And the focus behind this is a very simple one. It is the second of the great commandments, love thy neighbor as thyself. And to understand, therefore, that your neighbor is just as good as yourself, has many skills, but maybe in a much, much more difficult situation. I've always felt that when people are in a very bad state, the first thing they need is health. And it's not just physical health, they also need spiritual health. They also need psychiatric health. They need everything, in fact, when they're in that sort of situation. You, like me, believe that this is of profound importance. So the partner of LDS Charities, the Ammar Foundation, we put these little leaflets together. We don't do much on this sort of thing with such a low overhead cost, but Andrew and Chris do pick them up from them because they have them. We brought some copies. Thank you so much, both of you. And you will find a lot that will interest you in there, because it's the partnership between you and me. And that's our practical way of showing the second of the great commandments, which is love thy neighbor. I started my work with the Iraqi people with the genocide of the Marsh Arabs. And that is the world's oldest and biggest wetland that Saddam progressively destroyed. And he nearly completed it. It was down to 8% of existence when the troops entered in 2003. Since then, some has been recovered, but not nearly enough. And the tragedy of that was that I kept saying it. I was popping in and out over the border, and others kept saying it, and the world wouldn't listen. It wasn't just the destruction of the world's largest wetlands, it was also the destruction of the world's oldest and largest wetland farmings. And this goes right back to Sumerian days, it goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, it goes back to Noah's Ark. This is ancient history that reflects directly on you and my bloodlines and our cultures and civilizations. And for a decade I shouted, and I have a loud voice. Nobody would listen until it all was done, and then they all wrung their hands. It reminded me very much indeed of being a child in a political household in 1945 when the concentration camps were discovered. And at a moment now when anti-Semitism is rising globally, we have to remember that, and we have to think about what on earth is going on. The Marsh people, most of them lost their lives, 99% of them lost their livelihoods. The world has lost the world's greatest wetland and this wonderful farming community, which showed how to farm on water, for about 10,000 years. It didn't come under the last ice age. The last ice age didn't get lower than Baghdad. It's probably even older than that. Sumerian heritage. We've lost that. We've lost it because people refuse to listen. So when I heard about the Yazidis, who I'd never heard of in my life, I realized it wasn't any longer just a question of trying to help people with health and education and jobs and futures, that you had to somehow get the world to listen. And of course, one thing behind all of that is, why are people persecuted? So with Jeff Holland and others, we set up a Windsor Conference dialogue with the Bishop's Bench of the House of Lords, with the Yazidis. This is our third round, and we're now incorporating more this coming time. Brett is kindly helping, all sorts of people are helping, because at the basis of all of this, as far as I can tell, having done a lot of analyses, you'll find in this little book, which again is available, a lot of this is due to religious persecution. And that's exactly why we've added a fourth leg to our table, as it were. It was unbalanced before. The Amar Foundation, health, education, and jobs and futures isn't enough. It has to be also faith. So religious persecution, the driver for forced migration. And what is so fascinating about working with all of you is that you've achieved this wonderful bridge between deprivation, persecution, collapse, horriblenesses, and you've actually achieved coming back again and succeeding. You're a fantastic example as to what to do to turn destruction, to turn disaster into happiness and joy and success. You'll find in this little book, if you have a moment to look at it, you'll find a whole set of tables that I got created by various people. And they're not finished yet. We're doing more. Because I picked out, rather sort of, just in order to make the pattern, one religion persecuting another, persecuting another, persecuting another, persecuting another. It was almost everyone in this horrible circle is not only persecuted, but sadly also persecutes. I also have a persecuted background, although I don't feel that way at all, because it's some generations back. In 1605, I think it was, one of my immediate forebears, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, came over in a cask, an empty wine cask from France, because he was a Huguenot, and they were all being killed by the Catholics in France. So you'll find in here a sort of halfway house product. I'm sure we've got another 2 or 3 years to do with it, because we're picking out stuff that other people aren't looking at. And why can we do that? Is because we're working all together on the ground floor with the grassroots. We're experiencing this persecution almost as it happens. Andrew and I, the week before last, we were up again with the Yazidis in the north of Iraq, just outside Dohuk. We came because we had more to offer. And that, of course, incorporates you, because we're working as a partnership. As much as we possibly can in as many places as possible. Not enough, and there's more to come, because we're a fantastic set of partners. Little example. The Yazidis, whose religion I will explain in a moment, the Yazidis have lost hundreds of thousands of their people. This means that the 350,000 or so which were left in camps represent almost all the Yazidis left standing. About 50,000 are not in camps, and they're starting to try to trickle back. Very difficult to trickle back to their former villages and homes and cities and towns. Why? Because the rapists were, of course, and the murderers and the torturers, as usual, as always, they were the local people. So one poor girl said, when I saw her in 2015, she said she couldn't understand it because she was being raped by the local dentist who'd been in her grandfather's house to do his teeth 2 weeks earlier. Another one, she was being raped by the chairman of the local council. This isn't an unusual situation, colleagues and friends. The Bosnian mothers say just the same, that all the rapists are now back again in their jobs as the senior policemen patrolling the streets. This is how it happens. It is the society itself that has gone rotten in parts and attacks another piece of the society. Everyone always says, oh, it's the outsiders. At the moment, for example, in the north of Iraq, there's a great call to try all these awful foreigners who invaded us and who came and raped our women. Of course, it isn't true. Yes, there was some particularly disgusting people who came in for money or because they were sadists or something from elsewhere. Some stupid, some cruel, some evil, some repugnant. But ladies and gentlemen, you can't walk into somebody else's country unless you've got a fantastic, huge army, unless you've got Mr. Putin with you and half his battalions with their rotten tanks behind him. You will not be able to do that. It actually comes from within. And that's exactly what happened here. So it's very difficult indeed to recover when in fact you can't see the way through. And what I noticed was that with the little boy, Amar, it's been a long time. He's now a British citizen. He's not working, but he's very comfortable because the society is looking after him. It's the recovery of belief. It's the recovery of an understanding. It's the recovery of trust. When I was a child, my father had a friend who was called Joad, a great philosopher. I didn't know that he was grand, but I do remember the title of his book, and I wondered about it when I was small because it seemed so very odd. It's a very famous book, I now know, called The Recovery of Belief. And that perhaps is the heart of the loss of everything when you've been persecuted for your faith. Why is it so important when you're persecuted for your faith? I've been looking around to find why it matters so much. I mean, it matters deeply to me, it matters profoundly to you, it matters to almost everyone I know. It even matters to those who are Shabak in Iraq, who are the non-faith people, the ones who are atheists or agnostics. And as usual, I turned to Shakespeare, and I wondered if this little quotation explained, it did to me, why faith is such a huge part of our identity. This comes from All's Well That Ends Well. Simply the thing I am shall make me live. And that's it, isn't it? Just simply the thing I am. And I think that when Andrew and I were with the Yazidis the other day, 10 days ago, I offered something that made them very happy. And this came from you, our partnership again. You have this amazing department, or I don't know what you call it, which deals with ancestry. Well, ancestry matters. Ancestry is hugely important. The Yazidis, many of their ancestors, their immediate families, they're in mass graves. They don't know if they'll ever find them again. A lot of them have disappeared completely. Some thousands are still said to be in captivity. Myself, I think they're probably dead. So thanks to Sharon Eubank, I met, last time I was here, the Ancestry Department people, and they very kindly said that if the Yazidis would agree, which is what I was suggesting, that they would bring them to the top of their list, and they would do it very fast. So I suggested this to the Yazidis, and they were overwhelmed with gratitude, because the recovery of their ancestry, of all these lost souls, lost people, lost bodies, the immediate family, the wider family, this particular Yazidi people, they are the most integrated I've ever met anywhere, largely because they don't marry in and don't marry out. So they are just that. And that's why it's possible to wipe them out. So they shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. This is the 72nd persecution by the local people over about 1,500 years. As they've shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, all of their ancestry has disappeared as well. So here's something we're doing together, which is going to make a whole lot of people, about 500,000 of them, very, very much happier indeed. The thing that therefore that really matters is that they should understand why their religion matters. If you live in a camp, utter misery, a sort of average length of about 11 years in a camp these days, you don't have anything there, you don't have any music, you don't have any acting, you don't have any art, you don't have any culture, you don't have any civilization. All these people learn how to do is to queue up for a food pack of the same ghastly food basket which is kindly provided by the World Food Programme. Same stuff every single week. Awful. And that's all they learn how to do. They don't learn, as you and I learned, how to enjoy the different cultures and civilizations that our predecessors have created. I mean, to give you a tiny, tiny comment that came to my mind, when I was small, I read Beowulf and struggled with some of the Anglo-Saxon. I learned from my DNA the other day that I'm really boring. I'm only Anglo-Saxon with a bit of Scotland and a bit of France. That's all. Very dull. But I was always struck by Beowulf's words. It said, "Wheredis Weezer ward hoard on liac." It's a great phrase when you translate it. It says, then the leader of the troop unlocked his word hoard. These children in the camps, they don't have any access to any word hoard in any language at all. So they get narrower and narrower and narrower. And I think that another thing we offered on this little visit, which has been gratefully received, where I hope one of you is going to be at least involved, if not more, is music. Their faith is a very important faith. It is a one-God faith. It is a God that is a little bit like the Jewish God, Yahweh, the unknowable. So far, so big, so powerful, so huge, so far away. They pray a great deal, very beautiful prayers, very simple prayers. To the light, thanking God for the light every morning. At the midday, that's when the sun rises. At midday, thanking God for the heat of the day. As the sun goes down, thanking God for having given them the day. And as they go to bed, thanking God for keeping them alive. So they pray first of all in their prayers for the other, and then they pray for themselves. Very short, simple prayers. But I noticed on my first visit to them ages ago that they're all sung. And I studied as a musician, so I asked to see the music, and there is no music. So I've been feeling worried, we've all been feeling worried, that this was going to disappear. How could it not disappear if it's just in the heads of the priests? So we've offered something else, which is giving them great happiness. There's going to be quite a lot of work to do, and we're just beginning, is to have their music very well recorded, but much more importantly, to have it notated. And their music is complex. When you listen to it, and we had them with our Windsor Dialogue, we had them at Windsor Castle, and also in all three meetings we've had over the 3 years, we've had them part of that. We've had one of their priests, and he's maybe sung a grace before a meal. Very simple, but there's a lot inside each note, and it's complex. And so I've approached the Azerbaijanis, who are great musicians and who have notated their music for 100 years. And so we were able to suggest to the Yazidis that we could get all of that done for them as a gift from us to the Yazidis. And they've accepted that as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a huge amount to do. We cannot allow civilization to go on like this, by which I mean this constant, endless genocide, this constant assault of people, creation of migrant communities, unwillingly and miserably and tortured and tormented because of their religious belief. We have to act harder. And I leave you with another thought, which may be the only way in which we can get the change we seek, which is of profound importance, this change. It would change the whole face of the globe if we were able to get religious persecution stopped and religious freedom welcomed and loved. There's a comment in the famous speech of Martin Luther King when he was suggesting that a mechanism for reaching the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood which we seek is non-violent gadflies. I rather like that. That means each and every one of us can do something. Shall we do it? Yes. Thank you very much.
I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Professor Brett Scharffs. Professor Scharffs has one of those rare resumes that makes him eminently qualified to speak to us today. He's a graduate of Georgetown University. Boy, that's a big error. He's a Rhodes Scholar, graduate of the Yale Law School, and he's currently the Rex E. Lee Chair and Professor of Law and Director of the International Center for Law and Religious Studies at Brigham Young University. Professor Scharff has written more than 100 articles and given over 300 scholarly presentations. But I get to introduce him today because as a practicing lawyer, I deal with, as we talked earlier, the seamy underbelly of life while you are dealing with human dignity. But at least once in his career, he acted as an expert in one of my cases in dealing with fiduciary duty, dealing with ethics. And I found, and I can testify today, that Professor Scharff has a truly deep understanding of intellectual matters related to ethics, fiduciary duties, religion, and is a deep thinker, and I think you will find his comments today very valuable to you, and I welcome him here to address us. Thank you.
I'm going to need a little help getting the screen to work. Well, I'd like to thank Brent Hatch. He's a model of the type of lawyer I want to be and of the type of lawyer I would want to hire if my life, liberty, or property were in peril. I'd like to begin by expressing my deep appreciation to Senator Hatch. In his farewell speech on the Senate floor last December, Senator Hatch made a moving appeal for Americans to follow the better angels of their nature on the path of civility, pursuing principles of pluralism, and striving for unity in seeking mutual vindication of religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, and expressing his conviction that there is substantial common ground. In that speech, he identified the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, what we law professors call RFRA, as his greatest legislative accomplishment in his 42 years in the Senate. I agree with Senator Hatch. We need to find avenues to protect principled pluralism, to strive for inclusive freedom, and to protect reciprocal equality. To use his words, we need to get beyond thinking in terms of a zero-sum game. I'm also honored to share the podium today with Baroness Emma Nicholson of Winterbourne. Her work with the Amar Foundation in striving for peace and justice in Iraq by rebuilding lives through health, education, emergency aid, human rights, and women's empowerment, and in particular in facilitating the journey from persecution to inclusion for the Yazidi people, is an inspiration. I was with her at a conference she organized in Baghdad in November, as she mentioned, and I am proud to count myself as a junior partner in her work. Thanks also to Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, a leader in understanding the importance of courts in protecting religious freedom for all. I look forward to hearing from you shortly. Maybe less shortly than others would prefer. When I was 10 years old, around the time Senator Hatch was first elected to the Senate, I received for Christmas a gift that was my most cherished childhood possession, a Swiss Army knife. It had everything: scissors, a nail file, a toothpick, a can opener, a corkscrew, a saw, and several blades. I marveled at its beauty, precision, and usefulness, the many tools that were included in this single, perfectly crafted tool. Today, I'd like to talk about a concept that I have come to see as the Swiss Army knife of human rights and religious freedom. This is the idea: human dignity for everyone, everywhere. This was, in a real sense, the foundational idea that made the International Human Rights Project possible. And it is in a return to this foundational idea that I believe we can address the problems that ail human rights in our time, including freedom of religion and belief. Today, I would like to discuss a major international initiative which culminated in the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere, adopted by a distinguished group of scholars, human rights experts, and political leaders in Uruguay in December 2018. December 8th of last year was the 70th anniversary of the United Nations unanimous adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, on a cold and rainy night in Paris in 1948. For several years, we at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies have been thinking about something meaningful we could do to commemorate this important anniversary, and also something we could do to try to refocus, refresh, and renew human rights discourse, which has become quite politicized, controversial, and divisive in recent years. Last January, Jan Figel, the European Union's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside the EU, visited BYU Law School for 3 days, and he, Cole Durham, and I brainstormed about what we could do to celebrate this anniversary and to help affect what Ambassador Figel has described as the need for climate change with respect to human rights discourse. During our discussions, he shared a story that was a turning point in our deliberations. He described an experience that is common in his work as EU Special Envoy. Hello, Pakistan? This is Jan Figel, the EU Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside the EU, and I'd like to come meet. This, he explained, is met with a long silence, followed by the words, "We're really busy." Now, Jan is a patient fellow, so he doesn't say much more. He just pauses again, and eventually they ask, skeptically, a follow-up question. Well, what do you want to talk about? And he says, I'd like to come talk about human dignity and how it's important for all people in all places, at all times, and how it relates to religious freedom. And the response, he says, goes something like this. Dignity. Karama in Arabic. That's an important concept in the Quran and something we Muslims believe in deeply. Why don't you come? Maybe we do have something that we can talk about. And Jan Figel has now been back to Pakistan, not a bastion of freedom of religion and belief, 3 times for increasingly public discussions of human dignity for all and of religious freedom for all. His last visit was a large national conference that was televised around the country. And so, this little concept of human dignity became the door opener, the bridge builder, the conversation starter that he had been looking for. He noted that human dignity is an interesting concept because it is at once the foundation of human rights, but it's also the telos, or the end, of human rights. And so when we ask, what's the purpose of human rights? It is to achieve human dignity for everyone. It's also a metric that we can use to evaluate performance. When we ask, how is this country doing with respect to human rights? If we could ask only one question, the question we might ask is, what's happening with respect to the protection and promotion of human dignity? As we began this brainstorming, we quickly came to realize that human dignity had been a really important part of the genesis of the Human Rights Project at the end of World War II. I was recently in New Orleans at the World War II Museum, and I found this quote on the wall from General Douglas MacArthur at the time of the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II. He said, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." At the end of World War II, it was not the great powers that insisted upon human rights. The USSR was not interested due to its collectivist ideology. Great Britain was not particularly interested because it wanted to hold on to what remained of its colonial empire. And the United States was not particularly interested because of deep issues of racial discrimination and segregation. It was delegates like Carlos Romulo from the Philippines at UN headquarters that would not let human rights fall off the agenda. As he put it, "I became a nuisance, a gadfly, a pest. I prowled corridors, buttonholed delegates, cornered unwilling victims in hotel lobbies and men's rooms." Eventually, a Human Rights Commission was created with 18 countries represented, with Eleanor Roosevelt chosen to serve as chair. Side note, I think it's too bad that our children and grandchildren don't learn about this in the history classes that they take in our American high schools. When these 18 countries that comprised the UN Human Rights Commission in 1947 began their work, drafting what would become the UDHR, they quickly reached an impasse. There were too many different ideas of where to start and what should be included. A first draft prepared by the Commission's secretary, John Humphrey of Canada, was hundreds of pages in length. Finally, one of the members of the drafting committee, P.C. Cheng from China, recalled that the concept of human dignity had been mentioned, albeit almost in passing, in the preamble of the United Nations Charter. "Perhaps we can start there," he suggested. This broke the logjam, and focusing on human dignity helped the process of identifying, specifying, and articulating the 30 brief articles that comprise the final text of the Universal Declaration. The preamble of the UDHR begins with a recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and that this is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So there we see human dignity in the first sentence of the preamble. And Article 1 of the Declaration proclaims all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And so there again, in the first operative provision, Article 1, we see human dignity. For the drafters of the Punta del Este Declaration, our hope became that in our historical moment as well, at a time when climate change is needed in human rights discourse, a return to this basic foundational principle of human dignity can serve a similar work. Over the year 2018, our center, in partnership with a global group of institutions and scholars, held 4 conferences focusing on human dignity. And at each, we presented and received feedback upon successive drafts of what would become the Punta del Este Declaration, resulting in ongoing refinement. The first conference was at Central European University in Budapest. Some of you will be aware of this university because it's being shut down by President Orban in Hungary. The focus of the conference was on the prospect that human dignity could help move human rights discourse from tensions and conflict towards rejuvenation, reconciliation, and perhaps a restoration of human rights. In August, during our 3-week Oxford teaching program, we held another conference focusing on the founding figures of human rights, including Eleanor Roosevelt, P.C. Cheng, and Charles Malik. The role of human dignity as a foundational principle of human rights and the practical uses of human dignity as a human rights concept. This is where the image of the Swiss Army knife came to mind. And last October, we held our 25th anniversary annual Law and Religion Symposium at BYU Law School, which focused on the connections between human dignity and freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. One of the key instruments here is the Vatican II Declaration, Dignitatis Humanae, which articulates a vision of human dignity as the deep foundation of the Catholic Church's doctrine of religious freedom. You don't have to be Catholic to be inspired by the deep implications of our shared human dignity for freedom of religion and belief. All of this culminated in a 2-day conference at Punta del Este, Uruguay in December 2018, where a group of 40 scholars, human rights experts, and political leaders from around the world gathered and spent 2 days finalizing and agreeing upon the text of the Declaration. Punta del Este has symbolic significance. Uruguay is a secular state in the southern hemisphere, which itself is quite religious. Punta del Este is located at the easternmost point on that part of Latin America and is famous for its lighthouse. This juxtaposition of south and north, east and west, and the overriding image of a light shining outwards was quite meaningful. The Punta del Este gathering included experts from many countries, and there were 68 original signatories from 35 countries, including the delegates to the Punta del Este conference, the conveners of the conference, as well as many who had participated in the 3 other human dignity conferences earlier in the year. We have produced a brochure that describes the background and drafting of the Declaration, includes the preamble and text, as well as the initial signatories. The images that I've been sharing with you come from that brochure, and I've brought some copies if anyone is interested. All of the photos in the brochure are by the acclaimed portrait photographer Steve McMurray, best known for his 1984 National Geographic cover of an Afghan girl. Almost everyone remembers that cover. We chose his images to accompany the Declaration because, especially when you focus on the eyes of the subjects, they exude dignity. As one of our colleagues from Vietnam observed recently, these images do not so much capture their subject as we are captured by them. The Declaration includes a preamble and 10 articles, each of which focuses on some of the practical uses of human dignity. I've already mentioned the sense in which human dignity is the foundation, the objective, and also the criteria for evaluating human rights. I've also mentioned how it's useful in generating agreement and building common understanding. It's also helpful in defining and understanding the limits of human rights. It's also important in helping us focus on duties and responsibilities as well as rights. It's useful as a concept in human rights education, and in particular in reducing resistance to human rights education. It's valuable as a mechanism for seeking common ground, and it's an idea that is often implemented in legislation. It's also a concept used by courts and can be used to create reconciliation between groups in conflict. Number 9 is important because oftentimes human rights claims are in conflict with each other. Here we think, for example, of tensions between gay rights and religious freedom. One thing that makes progress possible is when everyone involved is focused on their commitment to the human dignity of everyone involved in the conflict. So you move beyond thinking about just the vindication of the rights for your group and begin thinking about the vindication of the rights for everyone. Again, echoing the appeal to our better angels. Finally, we note that focusing on human dignity helps us focus on the most egregious violations of human rights, the genocides, the forced migrations, but also the opportunities for progress. Think here of what Baroness Nicholson has just told us about the work with the Yazidis, focusing on faith and music and ancestry. The signatories of the Declaration are a varied and distinguished group of experts, and their names are also listed in the brochure. Additional signatories are invited and continue to add their names to the declaration as well. The declaration also has a website, dignityforeveryone.org, which anyone can go look at. You'll see the history of the conferences that were held, an introduction, and the declaration itself, translated into several languages, as well as an electronic version of the brochure. There's also a lot of secondary materials, including about a 40-page bibliography about articles and books about human dignity. This year, and during the next few years, we hope to amplify the message of human dignity for everyone, everywhere, in a variety of ways and in a variety of fora. This year, we have done this at several events in the United States, as well as at conferences in Rome and Bologna, in India, South Africa, Laos, and Vietnam, and today here at the University of Utah. Events also scheduled this year include Abu Dhabi in April, Botswana in May, Provo in June, 2 universities in Indonesia in June, at teaching programs and conferences in China in July, and at 3 workshops and conferences at Oxford University in July and August. And this year, again, our BYU Law and Religion Symposium will again address the theme of the connections between human dignity and religious freedom. There are also several books in the work. One, a detailed explanation of the Punta del Este Declaration, line by line, a commentary. One on the founding figures of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor and PC and Charles and others. Another on the uses of human dignity in the work of courts, with examples from various courts around the world. And another on religious and philosophical perspectives on human dignity. If anyone is interested in any of those topics, please let me know. As Steve McCurry's beautiful photographs remind us, all human beings are endowed by their Creator with inherent and inalienable human dignity. This dignity is the foundation for human rights and one of the most powerful justifications for religious freedom for all. As I conclude, I'd like to share with you why I love this photo. Even though one eye is covered and the other is obscured by a dirty and distorting lens, we are still drawn to the eye, the window to the soul of this man, reminding us all that we are each created in the image of God, are His children, and have a dignity, value, and status that is inestimable. I want to conclude with the word that Baroness Nicholson emphasized: philanthropy, love of mankind. That really is the heart of it. If we seek to find ways to help people like the Yazidis recover their belief, if we do it through mechanisms like health and education and economic opportunity, if we help them travel the road somehow from persecution to inclusion, this is a measure of our fulfilling that important charge. Thank you, Senator Hatch, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
I'm grateful for those of you who are participants. It's really wonderful to be able to kick this off this way. I'm going to thank you, Professor Scharffs. That was fantastic. My son Brent was right. You're one of the past, or one of the best we've got. And I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to listen to you and to learn from you. And Baroness Nicholson, I love Baroness Nicholson. She's a neat lady. I'll tell you, I want to thank you as well. Your remarks reminded us that religious liberty deserves our attention both at home and abroad. I'd also like to thank our Executive Director, Matt Sandgren. Matt, you really helped. He heaped on the praise, and I'm not sure I deserved it, but I'm grateful for what the Foundation for what you and your team at the Foundation have done to make this program a success. Next, it's my privilege to introduce you to our keynote speaker, a regal luminary and fellow foot soldier in the fight for religious freedom. Mr. Leonard Leo, I've known him for a long time, worked with him for a long time. Leonard is the Executive Vice President of the Federalist Society, one of the more interesting societies in this country. For those who may not know, the Federalist Society is arguably the most consequential legal organization of modern times. Founded in 1982, it gave birth to a renaissance in originalist thought, resurrecting the idea that a judge's role is to say what the law is, not what the judge wants it to be or thinks it should be. The Federalist Society has redefined the terms of legal debate by equipping a new generation of lawyers with a profound appreciation for the Constitution and an unwavering commitment to defend the Constitution. Leading the charge in that effort is our next speaker, Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo has fought on the front lines of the most significant judicial battles of the last decade. And somehow, he's always managed to come out on top. He's left an indelible imprint on the nation's courts, advising presidents, past and present, on nominations at all levels of the federal judiciary. I'm a personal witness to the great work he has done in this regard to get the best judges we possibly can at the federal judiciary. He was particularly instrumental in the confirmations of Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, not to mention hundreds of lower court judges. Core to Leonard's judicial philosophy is a steadfast belief in the preeminence of religious liberty. This belief springs from a place of personal faith. Leonard is a devout Roman Catholic who served 3 terms as the chairman to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom under the George W. Bush administration. Leonard is a leading voice on religious liberty issues. He's a lion of the law, and most importantly, a dear friend whom I've known for many years. I'm so grateful that Leonard would make the trip from Washington to be with us today. And I'm just as eager as the rest of you to hear his remarks. So with that, please join me in welcoming Leonard Leo to the podium.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here at the law school. This is my first visit here. Seems to be a great institution. Thank you to our previous speakers for their wonderful remarks about the protection of freedom of religion or belief abroad, such important areas, and both of you have made such important contributions in the defense of freedom of religion and of human dignity generally. I can't begin without first paying tribute to Senator Orrin Hatch. Could we imagine a successful conservative legal movement in this country without him? I certainly couldn't. Senator Hatch has been such a consequential leader when it comes to reaffirming our country's commitment to limited constitutional government. He was a real fighter in the Senate when there were few voices calling for a rededication to the proper role of the judiciary in our society. Senator Hatch, you've had an enormous impact on at least 2 generations of jurists and lawyers, and we all owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for that and for so much more. Thank you very much. My purpose today is to touch upon 3 topics that are often addressed separately, but that I believe need to be tied together. My proposition is very simple. It is ultimately impossible to bolster the freedom of religion without respecting and enforcing the structural limits on government power contained in our Constitution. And the judicial selection enterprise we are witnessing today by appointing structural constitutionalists will do more than most imagine to preserve the freedom of religion. But before we consider that current enterprise, we should step back and briefly consider the past. 232 years ago, our nation's founders gathered to preserve the rights they had fought so hard to secure and to save our young nation from anarchy and failure. They succeeded. The gift they gave us enabled the miracle of America, and the Constitution was then and is now the greatest charter of liberty ever written by human hands. The genius of the Constitution doesn't lie solely in the words that fill it, though they are brilliant. Nor does it lie mainly in the institutions the Constitution created, though they are remarkable as well. The real genius of the American Constitution lies in the space between those words and the clash between those institutions. There we find the principles that give our system life and verve: the separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, enumerated powers, and the sovereignty of the American people. This is what I call the structural Constitution. It is the built-in restraints on government power, without which there would be no real protection for individual freedom and no real respect afforded to the dignity of the human person. It is what James Madison referred to when he spoke of ambition being made to counteract ambition, and the need for external and internal controls on those who wield power over the nation. Without the structural Constitution, we would only have the ring of words and lofty promises. The Bill of Rights, including the freedom of religion contained therein, would be little more than a wish list, a mere parchment barrier. That it is not is testament to the wisdom of our founders and the system that they gave us. In this respect, America is truly unique, and the American people are truly lucky. When I was chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I went to some pretty grim places where liberty was little more than a mirage. I heard high-sounding boasts about the rights that governments respected, the United Nations declarations they signed, and on and on. But I saw rank and cruel persecution, where rights were denied because there were no meaningful limits on government power. Outside of small house churches in Indonesia, state security officers photograph worshipers who are then targeted for discrimination. Buddhist monks in Vietnam and China are swept up from the streets and detained. Visit a coffee house in Pakistan, northern Nigeria, or Egypt, and there is a decent chance you'll encounter a Christian or a minority Muslim with a story of being beaten by a mob for his beliefs, while police stood by and did nothing to help. Even the Soviet Union had a long list of guaranteed freedoms, so too does North Korea today. Every tin-ear dictatorship and president for life recites the human rights that it supposedly respects, but only the United States and a couple of other countries have constitutions that give the fullest possible force to human freedom. The structural Constitution is the framework for so much of our national success. When our leaders in courts have upheld that structure, America has flourished, with ample space for churches and other institutions at the core of civil society to improve the human condition. But when this structure has been undermined and damaged, the American people have paid the price through the slow and steady decline of liberty in all its forms and the corresponding rise in the size and scope of the government. It is no coincidence that here at home, so many threats to the freedom of religion are rooted in a decision to cast aside the concept of limited constitutional government. The contraception mandate that beset the Little Sisters of the Poor is ultimately the progeny of a statute that has no warrant under the limited enumerated powers of Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. The Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority retaliated against an employee who sought to observe Passover, and its only defense was a sleight of hand argument that is a byproduct of the fact that this agency structure simply cannot be squared with the separation of powers. If principles of federalism held sway and Congress refrained from improper delegation of its lawmaking power to a boundless administrative state, there likely would have been no need to come to the rescue of an Indian tribe that was the subject of an illegal undercover raid to confiscate fallen eagle feathers used in its religious ceremonies. Look at any number of incursions on conscience rights and the free exercise of religion, and often you'll find some departure from the structural limits on government power as our founding fathers understood them. But we are at the threshold of a very exciting moment, one which should give advocates of religious liberty some real hope. For the first time in my lifetime, I think for the first time in any of our lifetimes, the Supreme Court is close to reviving the structural Constitution. After decades in the wilderness, a majority of justices may soon regularly enforce the limits on government power and recognize the separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism, and recognize them not as quaint aspirations, but as concrete obligations. And as a result, we are on the verge of an era where the federal judiciary is again the friend of the American people's freedom and not our foe. We have never been so close to a recognition that if the mission is truly to protect freedom anywhere, then you are in the business of restraining the powers of government. This in turn helps to ensure a fierce independence that refuses to be ordered about, pushed around, or told when your faith is welcome and when it's not. Limiting government power naturally opens up space for a vibrant civil society, and religion is at the center of that civil society. This state of affairs, less government and more robust private ordering or civil society, is the most of American qualities. Not long ago, the legal momentum for that balance was basically all on the other side. Those days of losing in the courts of law by default are becoming more rare. But that doesn't mean that we can't still lose politically or culturally, or that defending religious freedom or our other liberties will ever get easy in the courts. One reason is this: while intolerance toward religion is not as heavy-handed as it is in other cultures, it's something arguably more disarming and insidious. It is fashionable. Just think of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Recall the superior attitudes directed at the Little Sisters during that controversy. For most of us, when we consider some of the most selfless people on earth, giving everything and asking for nothing, the feeling we get is not one of superiority in any conceivable sense of the word. Yet that's how these nuns were treated. These loving sisters, so filled with grace, in the legal case that concerned their rights of conscience against a contraception mandate in the context of health insurance benefits. In all the comfortable corners of elite culture here in the United States, who defended the Little Sisters? Where were the indignant editorials speaking up for them and denouncing the previous administration for its needless and obvious overreach? We get earnest lectures all the time about respect and protection for minority views in our diverse country, but the silence in this case conveyed a familiar message. You just have to hold the right minority views. Otherwise, well, you're on your own. The court fortunately did the right thing despite these cultural trends. Now, in all of this, I think we see two trends at work in the culture that here again I've noticed in other countries as well, which is what makes me nervous. The first is how freedom of religion, which implies hard legal protections, is amongst elite opinion in society giving way to what I would call a looser, airier concept of freedom of worship. The right to worship sounds very broad and generous, but it's narrow in consequence when you pause to think about it. The emphasis is all on belief and formal observance, leaving the rest a wide open question. Freedom of religion has a much more tangible meaning. It protects the right of conscience, not just in houses of worship, but in workplaces and schools and hospitals and government offices and anywhere else we go in this world. The short of it is that we should not be deceived by effusive talk about the right of worship, because it has an agenda not at all friendly to the real right of conscience guaranteed by the First Amendment. And we need courts to reject this trend. And there's a second trend that follows from this. As government policy becomes more grudging toward religious freedom, that attitude naturally spreads in the broader culture. A hostile stance in Washington creates space for groups with kindred ideological designs. We see this today in coercive tactics and nasty rhetoric directed against companies known for their religious and moral standards. The thinking of these activists seems to be, if the government's going after those companies, why shouldn't we? It just takes a little imagination to see where all of this leads if you let it go unanswered. Freedom of conscience, after all, is not exactly one give or take item on anyone's list of human needs and aspirations. What is closer to the heart or more essential to our identity, as the Baroness mentioned in her remarks? Give an inch in defense of conscience, and you can measure your other losses in yards. A government that suffocates something so elemental as the freedom of religion is not likely to be respectful of any other right. Now, fortunately, I believe President Donald Trump is committed to appointing principal jurists who will interpret the Constitution as it's written, which means defending the structural Constitution and interpreting the freedom of religion and other Bill of Rights guarantees as the framers understood them. Just over 2 years ago, I heard the President-elect lay out his expectations regarding the judicial selection process. Listening to him, I couldn't help but think that we were being charged to identify nominees who embodied the 4 cardinal virtues. We were basically told to find men and women who would be, first, prudent, having what St. Thomas Aquinas called wisdom concerning human affairs and right reason with respect to action. We needed to look for those who would do justice, giving to each his or her rightful due in light of every person's natural equality before the law in the eyes of God. We had to find people who would model temperance, who are moderate in thought and deed and humble enough to know the limited role that belongs to a judge. And finally, we were tasked with finding leaders who were, in the president's words, not weak, who would forsake outside influences and the fashions of the day, and who, when the criticism came, as it surely would hold fast to the fixed meaning of the Constitution and stand immovable in the midst of dangers because they possess the most important of the virtues, fortitude. The President is consistently appointing judges with this kind of character, and the Senate is doing its part to confirm them swiftly. For my part, I believe that nothing else this administration has done or will do is more important than this. And judging by the reaction from the other side, I suspect the left agrees. Now remember, the left's agenda is fundamentally incompatible with the original meaning of the Constitution. They need courts that give Congress a free pass when it oversteps its enumerated powers. They need justices who see no problem with giving more authority to the administrative state, that fourth branch of government that has little constitutional legitimacy these days. They need judges who avoid the inconvenience of competing and even contradictory decisions in the states as dictated by federalism. And most of all, they need a Supreme Court that places no limits on its power. A court that doesn't just issue rulings, but acts as the supreme ruler of the nation. A court of kings and queens in black robes, uncheckable, unaccountable, unstoppable. Attacks on constitutionalists will only worsen in the days ahead as we continue to make progress to restore the structural Constitution. But I think we can take heart that where once we were beaten, as in the nomination of Judge Robert Bork, now we have the infrastructure and the intensity required to persevere. We know what to expect and how to confront it, which is why Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh are on the court despite the ugly, underhanded attempts to stop them. Even so, we cannot stand still or rest on our laurels. The moment we do that is the moment we begin to fall behind again. And for the sake of our Constitution and our nation's future, we must press forward. Now is the time to further sharpen our arguments so that more and more Americans come to understand that limited constitutional government, those structural protections and restraints in our Constitution, protect the dignity of every person, regardless of race or gender or religion or class. This is at the very core of why we should defend the structural Constitution. If you care about religious liberty or any other Bill of Rights protections, you've got to stand up for the structural Constitution. Now is the time to engage the culture with renewed vigor, training a new generation of opinion leaders, scholars, and lawyers who will carry this message and this movement further than ever before. And now is the time to renew our conviction that we are in the main of the great American tradition. Our eyes are fixed on our sacred birthright of liberty, and we are striving to preserve the best of our nation's past for the benefit of America's future. Ronald Reagan spoke of our country as a shining city on a hill. George W. Bush spoke of our nation as the strongest, freest, and kindest nation on earth. These statements are true because of the structural Constitution, which gives the American people the room to be exceptional, to be who they are, to be what they are called to be by their Creator. And when Benjamin Franklin stood outside Independence Hall and declared that we had a republic, if we could keep it, he was calling on all of us in every generation to preserve the framework that he and our founders had so painstakingly crafted. Consequential leaders like Senator Hatch, have answered that call, and decades of work have brought us this far. Now let us stand together and stand courageously to finish the task that we are in until we dedicate our courts and then our country to the Constitution of the United States. Thank you all very much, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Leonard. I know that I speak for everyone here in expressing my appreciation for your work on behalf of religious liberty. And thank you, Baroness Nicholson, and Professor Scharffs, for your excellent remarks, and they were truly thought-provoking. Before we continue with the rest of the program, we'll take a quick 10-minute break before we convene our interfaith panel. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes. If we could ask everyone to start winding things down and coming and joining us. Welcome back. We're eager to get going with the rest of the program, so let's jump in. This morning, we've already heard from thought leaders and policymakers on religious liberty, and now we'll hear from the boots on the ground. Our Interfaith Roundtable features a great lineup of local community leaders who deal with these issues in their day-to-day lives. These women and men see where the rubber hits the road, so we're excited to get their perspective on religious liberty. But before we begin, I wanted to excuse Bishop Oscar Solis from the Catholic Diocese. He was unable to attend due to commitments for preparations for Holy Week. Still, he sends his sincere gratitude to the Foundation for the invitation to participate and his warmest regards to everyone here. We actually just saw him yesterday, and he was really wishing he could be here. Now, let me quickly introduce each of the members on our panel. You, of course, know Baroness Nicholson, Professor Scharffs, and Leonard Leo from their earlier remarks. Joining us today, we also have Mr. Awais Ahmed, the chairman of the Utah Muslim Civic League and an active member of the Islamic Society of Greater Salt Lake. Elder Jack N. Gerard, a member of the Quorum of the 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Dr. Neil Neelamagam, a founding trustee of the Sri Ganesha Hindu Temple in the Salt Lake Valley. Ms. Pamela Atkinson, an elder in the First Presbyterian Church and a well-known advocate for Utah's less fortunate. In fact, the reason why she was running behind is because she was helping the homeless. And Rabbi Avremi Zippel, the director of Young Jewish Professionals for Chabad Lubavitch of Utah. Now, with those brief introductions, let's get started. And I want to say, this is not going to be structured. We're not going to, we've had the structured portion of the event. I want this to be much more organic. I want you all to feel free to jump in if you have a comment. And I don't, we come from the Senate, so you can speak as long as you would like until you start seeing people glaze over. But don't feel constrained by the time. We want you to be able to share and speak and do. So Neil, let's begin with you. Just to start off, you know, in speaking with you ahead of this program, you shared what a wonderful relationship you enjoy with many faiths in this area. And you know, what I wanted to hear from you, and we'd like to have others weigh in, is what advice would you give to others here in the room or here on the panel who are struggling with connecting with others of other faiths?
Thank you for the query, Mr. Sandgren. I would also like to thank the Hatch Foundation and Senator Hatch.
Is the microphone on there?
Symposium. I've written the answers, so I'm going to read the answers. It's much easier so that I don't make mistakes. The state of Utah believes in the core principles of religious liberty. The Winter Olympics of 2002 enhanced the different interfaith groups of Christian denominations of the past. They were interfaith groups. They were mainly Christian denominations. 2002 brought other religions into that fore. Then a Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable was created at that time. And there are other roundtables in Provo, Utah Valley Interfaith Group, and there's one in Tuala and other places. There's a student group called Coexist. So these are the interfaith groups in Utah that promote dialogue among different religious belief people. Anybody can join them. The information is available on the internet.
Great, thank you. Elder Gerard, you look like you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to add to what was said earlier, and to thank you, Matt, and particularly Senator Hatch, for bringing us together. To your question of how do we facilitate these dialogues, I think this is a perfect example as to how we come together, because there's a lot more we agree on than we disagree on. We've all got our various doctrines and traditions and principles associated with our theology, our faith, but fundamentally we're all in this conversation together. Because as part of our doctrine, as we protect our interests in religious liberty, it should be equally protective of all those here and many others that aren't with us today. And so we're grateful to you, to Senator Hatch and the Foundation, as kind of your inaugural event to address this fundamental topic. Being a relative newcomer to the Salt Lake area, or to the Utah area, many years in Washington, D.C., we developed a great interfaith relationship out there, where we would come together to articulate our views collectively. But I think there's also a model from the interfaith perspective that can help us in broader society as we grapple with some of these questions. As Leonard spoke of earlier, it's become fashionable as our society evolves and changes that we need to be on the forefront of helping others understand that in society generally we agree on 90% of everything. We can resolve some of our difference in a very respectful, compatible way where we respect all interest in the process of protecting, particularly in our case, the religious liberty interests.
Thank you. Neil, talk a little about your temple and the kind of community support you received, and what a beautiful temple it is in the Salt Lake area. Yeah.
So many people who helped us over the years. The growing Hindu community of the Utah pursued bringing a temple in Utah to practice the religion, cultural activities, and we did the fundraising. We had volunteer construction along with the regular construction force helping us. And it took us about 8 years to move from the temporary abode we had with the deity. When we started the full-fledged project in 1995, a neighbor of one of our founding trustees made connection with the president, Gordon B. Hinckley, of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Public relations officers from there talked to us, and they gave us considerable input including a donation to follow. Our Muslim friends who were initiating Khatija Mosque around the same time, they gave us a lot of other legal input to us, what has to be taken care of. The Sikhs and Jains, other religions, they also participate with us. The local media, Salt Lake Tribune, Desert News, television stations, were helpful in disseminating positive news about our faith and our efforts. Our LDS neighbor, suggested where we can go buy the land and build a temple. The cultural wing of our temple, India Cultural Center, benefited from one of our lifetime trustees, corporate friends. One of them includes Scott Anderson, and Senator Hatch was one of our guests of honor during our fundraising in year 2000 for our cultural center. We have also had few good men in the city of South Jordan who helped us getting the permit to construct the temple. And a local law firm provided pro bono help to establish our rights in getting the right of way. These are all community help. Without the community help, we wouldn't be here. Because faith is, everybody has faith. They want to practice their faith. They allowed us to practice our faith, to live and let live.
I love that message, that it was a community effort. It wasn't just specific to one church, one religion.
No.
But it was everyone helping.
Everyone helping. And
wonderful.
Then, during 2003, when we started the construction, our local church ward sent 40 volunteers to help in landscaping for 3 weekends. So there's another community help we had. And our temple expansion by the still growing Hindu community and rededication, we call it Kumbhabhishekam, in 2015, received felicitations from several local religious leaders and elected officials who believe in religious liberty. Our Jewish friends were our photographers for the 3-day event. Each year we participate in the Interfaith Roundtable open houses and sacred music evening programs held in the Mormon Tabernacle. Our temple is open to all 7 days a week and is in the city of 3 temples. That's in South Jordan. It's got 2 LDS temples and 1 Hindu temple. Our governor's first inauguration in 2013 was invoked with a Hindu prayer. The person was my wife who did that. We have visits by local children coming in busloads, learning world religions. So there's another practice Utah has, teaching about world religions in all schools and colleges. Our temple architecture and sculptures are an enhancement to the art world of Utah cities. And finally, I want to say Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let there be peace.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Pamela.
When I first came to Utah, it was only then that I realized how large the Church of Jesus Christ was. And that if you weren't a member, you weren't involved in a lot of activities that happened in your neighborhood. They had ward parties, ward dinners, ward this. But over the years, I've noticed the change. And now I get flyers on my doorstep that say, please come to the neighborhood ice cream social. Please come to the neighborhood dinner. It's become much more inclusive. I have a very curious mind, and so I found out a great deal about the Church of Jesus Christ. Excuse me, I'm going to make that error. But I also wanted to find out about other faiths here in Utah. I sometimes play hooky from my Presbyterian church, and I go to the to the Calvary Church. Many of you know Pastor Franz Davis. And at the Calvary Baptist Church, I have learned to stand and sing and clap and sway all at the same time, multitasking. But I love the warmth of the Baptists. They greet you when you come in, and you immediately feel part of their family. But I visited many of the other faiths as well. And it's been great through the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable to see more and more people of diverse faiths and beliefs coming together and sharing with one another and feeling very comfortable about it. One of my other roles here in Utah is I work as an advisor to Governor Gary Herbert. We have one of the greatest governors, I think, in the United States. And I go to his leadership meetings and strategy meetings. And one day after a leadership meeting, he said, "Pamela, I don't know as much about other faiths." He's a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. And he said, "I'd really like to learn more." So he said, "I want you to set up a luncheon with diverse faiths at the mansion." And this year, we will be having an interfaith luncheon with the governor, number 7. And my job is to invite faith leaders of different faiths and diverse geographically, diverse gender-wise, but also diverse faith-wise. And it is absolutely wonderful to see how people interact from the different faiths together. Admittedly, I seat people very deliberately. I do not seat people with other faith leaders who know each other. But there's a lot of business cards being handed out. There's a lot of sharing. And those friendships continue well after the luncheon. But I've learned a great deal about so many different faiths. Sometimes I feel a little bit Baptist, a bit Presbyterian, of course. I feel a little bit Jewish. I feel a little bit Methodist. I've just learned so much and incorporated so much. When I first met Rabbi Zippel and his father, Rabbi Benny Zippel, Rabbi Benny said, "Pamela, I do not shake hands with women." And I was really taken aback, and I thought, that's hard for me. I love shaking hands and touching people and hugging people. And he explained why, and then I read up on it more. And now I am very comfortable with the rabbi doing this, and I'm not offended because I learned and understand the culture and their religious beliefs and why they believe as they do. And for the diversity that we have here in Salt Lake and in Utah, it's becoming more and more evident that we have many more similarities. And then if we take those similarities, the differences, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, do take care of themselves. And we can enjoy wonderful events. We can enjoy wonderful conversations. And I may think, well, they think very differently from me. But as I've opened my mind and listened very carefully, I thought, that's okay. I can be friends with this person, even though we have some differences. But look at the many similarities that we have in the very different faiths.
So, hearing Pamela talk about her social and worship experiences, and we think about the community service that she's involved in, can you all think of some of your own experiences that have brought you together? Because, Pamela, when we were talking about this, she said, I have been playing hooky, and I've got to get back to my church because she's been off in so many other congregations, and such an example of, and she has said, and I agree, that as we become a part of the community where it's no longer a ward party but a neighborhood party, that we all look out for one another. And that is, in essence, protecting religious liberty. Right? Aves.
So I grew up in Davis County, and I'm of Pakistani descendants. And so growing up there, there was a huge, I was a huge minority. So I went to Davis High School, and there was 1,000 people in my graduating class, and I was one of 8 minorities and only 1 Muslim. So I had to really, reflect on why I believed what I believed and who I was. And at that time, a lot of my Mormon friends, they thought that they were a majority religion in the world. So they were looking at me and saying, oh, this Muslim thing, what are you guys? They had no idea that, we believe in Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. They had no idea that Surah Maryam, or the chapter of Mary, is a chapter in the Quran. So as I went through that experience, right, and as I became friends with so many people from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they became my brothers, I had a hard time looking as this us and them kind of worldview. And what I'd like to say is, first of all, thank you, Senator Orrin Hatch, for having this event. And we, as leaders of our various communities, we can go out and help kind of break this us and them lens. And in a world where everything is going towards technology, and words like algorithm and artificial intelligence is what everybody's looking at, I think there's so many simple things that we can do to kind of break those connections, right? Like in our tradition, someone went and asked one of our teachers, and he said, my community is very broken. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and how can from our tradition, how can I break this? And he was expecting some, very, philosophical, very poignant answer. And he said, the teacher said, learn how to make very good tea, right? Just go out and meet with your neighbors, go out and spend time with other folks. And what will happen is there was a research study done that they said 70% of people that have never met a Muslim, they have an unfavorable opinion of them. And 70% of the people that have met a Muslim, they have a favorable opinion for them. So sometimes I think we get very caught up in these very complicated solutions to these problems, and I think we can make a lot of strides with some of these simple solutions that are in all of our traditions.
Aves, while we have you, can you shed light on how the Muslim community was treated by the general public and even the government, for example, after 9/11, and then compare that to the recent tragic event in New Zealand, how if things had changed in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a segue from the story that I talked to you about, right? So originally, my father, he was a professor in Nigeria, and he in the 70s, where they had discovered oil, and he worked there for about 8 years, and he wanted to go back to Pakistan and retire. So he went back to Pakistan shortly after I was born, and he lost a lot of his money based because of corruption and other things that were happening in that at that time. And what happened is he had a diplomatic passport, and so he had been to countries all across the world. And he found that America, or the United States of America, had very, very similar ideals and beliefs on that he felt like kind of personified his own, right? So when he came here, and we grew up in the way that I kind of mentioned to you, right? After this 9/11, it was kind of a discovery, right? People said, "Hey, this happened. What is Islam?" Right? And so those same LDS friends that I had, now they had traveled across the world in missions, which I applaud that tradition, and they had met so many Muslim people, and so they called me back saying, "Oh, just kidding, you know, we're the minority, right?" So they said, "Hey, thank you, you know, like they appreciated our relationship, and we started keeping more in contact." So even out of such a horrific event, right, the reaction of people was starting to get to know each other. So what happened is a year and a half ago, one of my dear friends and mentors, Khosrow Samnani, he had this idea of the Utah Muslim Civic League. So what we did was there's about 60,000 Muslims in the valley, and over 120 different countries. And what's happened is, as they've came here, a lot of them have been refugees. So they've started making these different centers, right, based on their language, or so it's easy for them to understand. So they feel, very kind of disconnected. And so we thought that it would be great to have a platform where we connected those people, and we helped we helped overcome some of the barriers that they had to get civically involved. So we did that, and it was very successful, right? Some of the stuff that I'll also go into later when I have the chance is that they felt they had the story of their vote didn't count, or that it didn't matter. So luckily we were able to change some of that and develop a lot of relationships with the community leaders, with the faith leaders, and the political leaders. So now fast forward to this tragedy that happened in New Zealand, right? So instead of people calling and saying, what is Islam, and what's going on, we had a very opposite reaction, right? We had folks call us, whether it was people from the Church of the Latter-day Saints, or if we had the Hindu community or any of the communities. They called and said, "Look, we're not calling because we're the mayor. We're not calling because we're the head of the FBI. We're calling because we're your friends. We know you. We care about your community," right? So we had over 20 different officials show up on that day, and personally texting and calling me, over the night and in the morning. So I think the key takeaway from all that is that the relationship building that we did on both sides, right? When these incidences were not happening, as they happened, and as we're having more problems in the future, there's going to be this trust built. And Franklin Covey has a really good talk called The Speed of Trust, right? And he talks about how Warren Buffett doesn't really use many attorneys in his deals, right? He doesn't use them because people trust what he's going to say. So he saves millions of dollars and a lot of bureaucracy, right? And so I kind of noticed that in this instant where we had this trust built, and it wasn't having to call people up and explaining to them that this is who we are, this is what we're about. All of that red tape was cut, and we were just dealing with our brothers and friends.
Thank you for that. Rabbi Zippel, can you talk to us just on a different subject, but it's very similar, talking about the rising tide of anti-Semitism, and what can we, and some of the hostilities that we've seen toward your faith and others, what can we do to be more mindful, or what can we do to stop this violence?
Thanks, Matt. I want to kind of just echo for a second before I address the question, my appreciation towards the foundation and towards our presenters. And I must say, Senator Hatch, being a lifelong Utahn, it's actually a little bit disconcerting sitting over here with a microphone and seeing you in the audience. It's a little bit weird, I'll be honest. It takes a little bit of getting used to.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, but on the topic of anti-Semitism and hostilities towards minorities, a lot of what our presenter spoke about this morning really was powerful for me. My parents have been here now for 27 years. And on the topic of religious liberty, it's kind of interesting to see some of the two realities of religious liberties that, the challenges that they went through when they moved here and kind of what my generation goes through. So in 1993, my parents had been here for a year. They wanted to put up a menorah downtown, a public menorah in honor of Hanukkah. And this was in the height of it all. The ACLU threatened to sue, and it became this whole song and dance about religious liberty, et cetera, and the state was amazing, and the city was amazing, and Mayor Corradini back in the day was amazing, and the menorah went up, and I think about that now because, in my generation, putting up menorahs in public places, there's a beautiful one that goes up every year now outside of Bravenel Hall on county property. It's such a foregone conclusion in a certain sense, and that's not our battle. But I think that the battle that we do have in today's day and age, and the challenge of religious liberty, and especially as that ties into trends in anti-Semitism, et cetera, I think it focuses on a different dynamic, which some of our earlier presenters spoke about, and it's something which has really, rung home very personally for me very recently. So I was raised here in Salt Lake, and for me, my entire life was one, I knew no other reality than looking very different than, anybody else that I knew in my little bubble. I wore a kippah and the tzitzis and the fringes, and I looked different. And that was something which I knew no other reality. And so, the stairs in the supermarket and the fact that people do a double take when they see you in public, this was it was par for the course. And it wasn't something which was surprising to me because it was, again, the only life that I knew. About a little over 2 months ago, I made the decision to speak out publicly about being a survivor of sexual abuse. And it was a decision which came with a lot of contemplation because, as any survivor will tell you, there's this thought process: what will people think about you with this information? So that you're an observant Jew, that they can stomach, but you really tend to worry about when people have this information, when people know this about this very private part of your life, how does that influence and how does that color the way they see you and the way they think about you? And I came to a place where I was comfortable with that, and I was ready to kind of accept people's reactions come what may, and so I did that. But it gave me such interesting perspective into the fact how concerned we are about how people view us due to any sort of characteristic in our life, but how that's also a double-edged sword. What are the initial thoughts that we think about, that cross our minds when we see somebody else that has a different lifestyle than our own, that may have had a different childhood than our own, that believes in a different faith than our own, that does something different than our own life? We spend so much time obsessing about what are people going to think about me, and I think that it gives us a lot of perspective of how do I think about others. I'm all concerned about, when people know this about me, how will that color their perception? But what's my perception? What's my perception when I know that somebody else, has a different sexual orientation, or somebody else has made a different set of choices in their life, et cetera, et cetera? What are the initial thoughts that go through my head? And I think that as a community, not as lawmakers and not as policymakers, but as human beings, when we speak about the idea of religious liberty and combating, rising trends in anti-Semitism and hostilities towards other minorities, it really starts with us, and it really behooves us to really take into account the way we view other people and how that, affects our initial reaction to them and how and kind of the feeling that we give them. And I want to conclude with a very interesting anecdote. We speak about religious liberty, and there's this very diverse panel. For those of us who are locals, we'll know that there's one religion, in a certain sense, one belief that unites all Utahns, regardless of whatever God they pray to, and it's a very holy season for that religion, and that's actually the Jazz. I don't know how vast the fandom is here, but the playoffs are starting on Sunday. And so on a serious note, I don't know how many of you actually came across, it was published in a sports publication, but it was one of the most powerful articles I've read recently. And so this past week, one of the Jazz players, Kyle Korver, wrote an op-ed about his kind of feelings towards privilege, being a white man in the United States, and with the recent events that had taken place at the Jazz game. And he started with such a powerful story. For those of you who have read it, you'll have to forgive me. I want to share it again because it struck such a chord with me. So he shares the story how 3-4 years ago he was playing in Atlanta, and the team had a back-to-back. So they played a game at home in Atlanta, and they flew into New York City, and they were going to play the next night in New York City. And the morning of the second game, the whole team woke up to the news that one of their teammates had gone out to a club last night, had gotten arrested, spent the night in jail, and this whole kind of thing had happened. And the teammate, who by a stroke of providence, actually also plays for the Jazz now, had his leg broken by the cops, by the NYPD in this altercation in a club, and it began this whole saga. And so he shares first person how sorry he feels, because when he heard that news, that his teammate, who is of African descent, is an African American, had been out late at night in a club in New York City and had gotten arrested and spent the night in jail, the first thing that came to his mind is, why was he out late at night and what had he done to bring this on his head? Not for a second realizing the dynamics of what it means for a black man to go out at night in New York City and may not feel welcome at a certain establishment, and the whole set of events that led up to this. And he writes this op-ed hoping to kind of atone for the mindset that he had shown 4 years ago, experiencing how inherent bias was the first thing that came to his mind. So you hear that this happens to your teammate. Well, why is the guy out at night? What did he do that might have brought this upon his head? And really kind of, the repentance that he wants to show for that. And it was so powerful for me. Really it shows us, I think, the best way to combat any sort of these, hostilities towards any human being in the world is really by taking a look at our own perspective and how we view any single human being in the world. And I know a lot of what Dr. King has shared has been shared today, and I see Dr. King's quote up on the wall. But, my favorite quote from Dr. King is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so, if we view any other human being in a certain light, that really is the beginning of the path and paves the way for being able to tackle this on a global level.
Wow, thank you. And Pamela.
Thank you for sharing that story. Baroness, you mentioned this morning, you were articulated very well about human dignity. And I was reminded of that again recently as I work with my homeless friends. One man, Peter, said he was from New York and he had been here for a year. And he said that I was the first person to touch him and shake his hand. He had not been touched in a year, and he said, when people walk past me, they avert their eyes. And so it's like I don't exist. And I was thinking about that this morning. The reason I was late, as Matt said, about a year and a half ago, one of the business people that I know well said, Pamela, you need to do something about the spiritual component of your homeless friends' lives. I mean, I know you pray for them, but what are you doing? Are you doing devotional? And I had to honestly say no. So I convened a group of diverse faith leaders, and every Thursday morning I go down to the Wigan Day Center and set up the chairs in a semicircle and have a different faith leader come, and he does or she does a 10 to 15 minute devotional. And I partner with Catholic Community Services. We provide burritos and bagels and cream cheese and orange juice. And food is very important. Half the people who come eat the food and leave. The other half stay. And we had 39 people who stayed this morning. The feedback I'm getting from my homeless friends and through this devotional is the fact that it makes them feel important. There's the human dignity aspect there, and they have diverse conversations. They're from diverse backgrounds, and when the faith leader, the pastor, involves them and includes them and engages them, we have some of the most interesting discussions, and they have a lot of questions, but they also have a lot of the answers. But a lot of what they say involves how they're being treated by people that they say they think they're Christians, but the way they treat us, we don't think they are. And it is this issue of human dignity, this issue of everybody being equal. With refugees with whom I work through CCS and the IRC, when they tell me how they're being treated and discriminated against, I cry. it is overwhelming to me, and to think that Utahns would treat our refugee friends with anything but dignity. We are all equal in life. We have different roles to play, I agree. But if we all play those roles, that's what brings the team together. As some of you know, my favorite acronym is TEAM, team. And together, everyone achieves more. Through different faith groups, we're finding out we're able to reach more people. Several years ago, we became alarmed at the number of suicides taking place in Utah. We decided to start a group for the prevention of suicide, an interfaith group. And we talked to the Church of Jesus Christ, and they made it clear they would love to be involved with us. They didn't want to take charge, though. So there were four of us who are founders of this group. There were four of us who are founders of this group, this is right. And we invited people from different faiths. And next Tuesday, we're having an interfaith summit on the prevention of child abuse. One of our Muslim leaders, the Imam from West Valley, he was a member of our group. And the day after our first planning meeting, he went back, and on the Friday, in the time of prayer in the mosque, he talked about child abuse, how prevalent it was, and how we must prevent it. And he was absolutely astounded at how many people came up to him afterwards. And he called me that evening and said, Pamela, what's the next step I need to take in helping my congregation? We also have an interfaith group working together on the prevention of suicide. And how do we prevent it? And how do we respond to it? And it was such a successful summit. We've been asked to do another larger one. And as we're looking at the issues of working together, treating one another with dignity, respecting the diverse beliefs, faiths, and culture, we're finding that we're making progress, and we're having quantifiable outcomes from all of these different meetings, but it takes working together and respecting the rights of everyone of different faiths.
Elder Gerard, a lot of folks, some people don't even think that religious freedom is threatened at this point in our culture and our society. They lean on the fact that we have the First Amendment. What's the problem? And so, from your church's perspective, why do you all care so much, and what's the concern? We have the Constitution. We listened, obviously, to what Leonard Leo had to say, but in your world, in your church, what gives?
Well, I think, Matt, there are a number of challenges out there. I know some people believe that it's a matter of constitutional protection, that's adequate, but we see, as I mentioned earlier, and I was touched by Leonard's comments, society evolves and changes. There's, if you will, increasing tension or friction that's created between some of those established, well-understood rights and others. As the rabbi talked about, I was touched by, how do we find that common interest? I shouldn't say we have, generally they've coined the phrase now, fairness for all. How do we find that balance, whereas the Baroness talked about the true definition of philanthropy as love of mankind, as the professor talked about human dignity. So when we look at those two together, we believe that should undergird or frame, if you will, how we protect the religious liberty interest in our society today as other tensions mount, as we seek to bless all mankind and give all mankind equal dignity, equal protection, equal respect, or however we may want to define it. I was also touched by Leonard's comment today, which I think is very real, and it goes back to all the great work Senator Hatch has done. the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There are proposals before the Congress to significantly limit that or to perhaps change it dramatically. That's not insignificant. If you will, we found balance in some of these different areas or rights. We've got to establish that with mutual understanding and respect for each other. Leonard talked about the fashionable nature as our society evolves. So we've got to be vigilant and diligent in coming together, but also, as Pamela spoke, getting into these communities where we learn each other's interests. We come to know each other. From our vantage point, service is the key to all of that, because we do respect human dignity. We acknowledge people, the love of mankind, true philanthropy for who they are. So we think there are challenges out there. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's something you can't rest on. As Leonard talked about, there's some people who would like to define religious liberty in a much narrower way than it has been historically as protected under the Bill of Rights. So yes, we do think there's a challenge before us. We should come together with common interest, but we should also get into the broader community to express our concern and see if we can't find a mutually respectful way, a fairness for all, to resolve some of these challenges.
Excellent. Anyone like to add on to that? Neil?
I just have a general comment. Because people have different faiths. We all like different colors. Nobody denies that. We all appreciate differences in nature. So having differences is not uncommon. So we should appreciate it and enhance our lives with that differences.
Thank you for that. Baroness Nicholson, you've been interested in the journey from persecution to inclusion. What do you believe are the most important components of that journey? In other words, what do we need to do?
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and a pleasure to listen to the other participants of the panel. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. I'm working, as you were saying, on religious persecution, not on religious tolerance, which I think is too soft. It's actually persecution that is going on. And it's persecution, I mentioned the wonderful people, the Yazidis, some of the quietest and most peaceful of people who've been aggressed and destroyed, almost destroyed. But I could quote and mirror that experience with a number of other countries where it's going on at this very moment, and where the victims, therefore, are left isolated and lost. So I am a politician, and modern politicians make laws. So inevitably, I think about the gaps in legislation. And one of the gaps in countries such as this, the ones that have these persecutions going on today, I can name a dozen, sadly, they are likely to lack legal recognition of the persecuted minorities. For example, I've been concentrating on Iraq, but I'll give other examples as well. In Iraq, for example, you cannot be a Jew. The Constitution excludes the Jew. So it's a clear example of the necessity to have a recognition that you actually exist, a recognition of identity. I've been mentioning identity this morning, and it's much more important to identity than just knowing who you are. It has to be others who recognize that you actually exist at all. A second example next door in Afghanistan, where females do not know, it's the only place in the globe, who their fathers are. They have been denied even that essential recognition of a personal identity, let alone a legal one. If you look into Pakistan, for example, and I'm just picking these countries at random, almost every country has some example where there is this sort of behavior, which is most countries. There's another variant of Islam, which is Ahmadiyya. And the Ahmadiyya, which mirror almost precisely, in my understanding, the version of Islam practiced by the Omanis, for example. In Pakistan, the Ahmadiyya do not have recognition as citizens. They're only allowed to do menial jobs. They're not allowed to use certain words and phrases. They can't use the term praise to God, for example. And I can give you these examples. I'm merely picking these countries because they're top of mind at the moment, and we're debating them in the House of Lords, for example. But I'm sorry to say they're everywhere. So I say, as a politician, the first step is to look at the identity problem and to make absolutely sure that you do everything you can to get this minority, it's likely to be a minority, recognized in law, recognized so they can stand for Parliament, so they can stand for Congress, so they can stand for election, even the local council, and they don't have to have reserved positions. Reserved positions are better than nothing, but they're not real identity. They're just a sop to Cerberus. If you remember, Syll went on biting people at the mouth of hell, even whatever you threw into his jaws to keep him quiet. So I think that's incredibly important. Those are the countries that are persecuting. But if I look at us, countries who are said not to be persecuting, the countries who have placed themselves self-placed on the side of being the goodies, as it were, self-placed on the side of being the rescuers, well, we also have a problem. We also have a job to do. So many elections I've been to where we have monitored, but all we're really interested in is going in for half an hour and looking at a ballot box or two, and then disappearing again and saying that it was a free and fair election. Because that suits maybe our national position or our government's position. That allows the World Bank to give a larger loan or to give a bigger guarantee. So that exemplifies the strengthening of what is likely to be a wholly undemocratic government. So we have a lot of work to do as well. This is not a one-sided problem. It is two-sided. It's the same coin.
Thank you for that. Avais and Rabbi. So Baroness hinted on the word religious tolerance, right? And so one of my teachers was saying how we have to change that word. So to me, tolerance is like you tolerate a bad smell or you tolerate something foul, right? All these traditions that we're talking about are full of beauty. So we as a community need to come up with something, with some better vernacular to address that. Now, the second thing as he was talking made me think was my teacher told me that if you want to eradicate fascism, you have to educate people. If you want to eradicate racism, you travel, right? And to the same, in the same breath, people that, like she mentioned some countries which happen to be majority, or very Islamic. So we as faith leaders, we have to actually look and we have to educate people what our tradition really is. So I was actually reading this earlier, and I took a screenshot from my phone. But the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he wrote a letter to the Christian monks. And this is an excerpt from it. And it says, "This is a letter which was issued by Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the messenger, the prophet, the faithful, who is sent to all the people as a trust on the part of God to all his creatures, that they may have no plea against God hereafter. Verily God is omnipotent, the wise. This letter is directed to the embracers of Islam as the covenant given to the followers of Jesus the Nazarene in the east and the west, the far and the near, the Arabs and the foreigners, the known and unknown. This letter contains the oath given unto them, and who disobeys that which is therein will be considered a disbeliever and a transgressor to that whereunto he is commanded. He will be regarded as one who has corrupted the oath of God, disbelieved his testament, rejected his authority, despised his religion, and made himself deserving of his curse, whether he is a sultan or any other believer of Islam. Whenever Christian monks, devotees, and pilgrims gather together, whether in a mountain or a valley, or den, or frequented place, or, hang on a second here. Or plain, or church, or the houses of worship. Verily, we are the back of them, and shall protect them, and their properties, and their morals, by myself, by my friends, by my assistants, for they are of my subjects under my protection. I shall exempt them from that which may disturb them, of the burdens which are paid by others as an oath of allegiance. They must not give anything of their income, but that which they pleases them. They must not be offended or disturbed, or coerced or compelled. Their judges should not be changed or prevented from accomplishing their offices, nor the monks disturbed in exercising their religious order, or the people of seclusion be stopped from dwelling in their cells. So this goes on, but my point is that in our tradition, this is the core of our tradition. But we as faith leaders in all of our tradition, we have to educate our people so that these misunderstandings can be eradicated.
Thank you. Rabbi Zippel.
I just wanted to touch on the idea of persecution, which the Baroness mentioned, because I think for my faith, it's something which is, we have a very, very vast history, and as things change, I think things tend to fall out of perspective. And so I shared with Matt last week, after the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh back in October, we had a vigil shortly thereafter at our synagogue, and it was remarkably attended, and I think that evening was really a role model for what a beautiful, dynamic community can look like. But there was a member of the press who came to the vigil and asked me on camera, Rabbi, would you comment on this new phenomenon of anti-Semitism? And so I told her, I said, with all due respect, that's inaccurate. The idea of this new phenomenon of anti-Semitism is about as old as Semitism. From the days when we had a faith, there were those who persecuted us. And what's interesting now is because I think for the most part, as the Jewish nation, persecution is not really part of our experience anymore. I think on a personal level, so my wife's grandmother, may she live and be well, she just turned 91. When I say she ran for her life, in communist Russia in the 1930s and 40s, she literally ran for weeks on end, barefoot through snowy fields. Her father had been snapped up by the authorities for the crime of spreading Judaism, and so she and her siblings and her mother were just kind of, fleeing from one barn to the next. And that was the life she knew, and now, you fast forward 2 generations later, and now, her granddaughter's husband is invited by a United States senator to sit on a panel and discuss faith and diversity. And so the idea of persecution, which is so much part of our path for thousands of years throughout our history, thankfully now is not a reality in that sense in most parts of the world. I mean, we live in countries like the United States and throughout Europe, which, although Europe is seeing some troubling trends, but for the most part, we have the ability to openly and freely practice our religions. However, and I think going to what Elder Gerard said, I think that should not, it should keep us constantly vigilant of the realities of religious acceptance. So yes, now we can openly practice our faith, but there's still so much work to be done in the arena of religious tolerance and religious acceptance and embracing the diversity that comes in these countries that we can now fortunately call home. Though persecution is no longer part of our past, we can practice openly and freely, we still need to make the efforts to make sure that our religion is something which we can practice freely, and other religions is something that we can practice freely, and that's, that behooves us as faith leaders, it behooves us as policymakers. But going back to what Avi said, and I love the line, it also behooves us to learn how to make tea. And, and though our faith is not something under threat, others are. And so go out there and have those conversations and learn how others who do not have that ability anymore, who don't have the same ability as you, how you can best be of service to them.
Thank you for that. Baroness.
A difficult question. Is that possible? Coming from a family that heavily supported the Balfour Declaration and would do the same again, how far is it possible for you to while forgiving the past, how far is it possible for you, while remembering it, to try to forget it, so that the Jew is not burdened, as you have already just this minute declared, by this horrible burden of the past? How far is it seen as right for you to be able to recall but still forget?
There was a gentleman in our community, some of you may have known him, I know he did a little bit of work in the interfaith community, who passed 2 weeks ago. His name was Abe Katz. I know Pamela had met him on several occasions. So he was a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald. Remarkable human being. It's a huge loss to our community. I know he lectured widely. He was the oldest and, as far as I know, most prominently known survivor here in the state. And so I shared shortly after his passing, I wrote a little piece about it, that the most amazing thing that I heard from Abe Katz, this is a man with a remarkable story. In addition to his survivor, he came to this country barely with the shirt on his back. I mean, calling what he wore on his back a shirt would be generous. Didn't know the language, had no money, and he made a life for himself, and he has the most remarkable story. All of that being said, the most remarkable thing that I would hear from Abe regularly whenever he spoke about his past, and he would develop this very steely resolve in his eyes when he would say it, he would always say, "You cannot live with hate in your heart." Which, I know I'm a rabbi, as Matt mentioned, for young people, the most entitled generation in the world, who, bear resentment and hate and all sort of that thing for failing a job interview, and who are just, some of the most, meet the most bitter yet successful people who just have that resentment. It's part of our history to keep it going. It's the way we're wired, and I don't know how it is that we just come to that, but you mentioned the Balfour Declaration, and you mentioned our history as a state, etc. I'm not quite sure how it happens, and I'm not quite sure what the method is and how that happens, but we have this inherent need, this inherent quality, characteristic, whatever you'll call it, to, in a certain sense, forget the injustices and forge ahead and try to create a better path and learn from those injustices that were perpetrated towards us, into learning from those mistakes and being a better society. And so, I think it's something which is important, and you give the example of the Balfour Declaration, when Israel became a state, to remember, all of that had happened leading to that event, and to make sure that they would be at the forefront of making sure that those injustices are not perpetrated against anybody else. And that's a constant battle, and one that I wouldn't say everyone's always successful at, but that's the responsibility, I think, that our people have carried with them for thousands of years, is not to live with hate in your heart. It is to move on. It is to, with a healthy measure of forgetting and not bearing resentment, to try to be that light unto the nations while not bearing that grudge. So it's not easy, but somehow, some way, we figured out a way to do it.
Leonard, when we talk about religious liberty, a lot of people put their trust in the judiciary to protect those rights. Compared to the other branches of government, is this a short-sighted or dangerous view?
I think the way to think about it maybe is to say that the courts are a necessary institution in defense of freedom of religion, but not sufficient. So it is part of the structure. It's our insurance policy, if you will, when other government actors fall by the boards and don't do what they're supposed to do. And in more recent American history, the courts have been very important in that regard, because we have had some problems with legislatures and with the executive branch. So, but you're quite. I mean, your question obviously suggests that the courts are not ultimately going to save you if you have if the political institutions are not attuned to the defense and preservation of religious freedom. The best way to think about that is to look at other countries and to see how things degraded there. So when I was on the Religious Freedom Commission, I think we visited 40-some countries around the world, and we saw an interesting set of evolutionary trends. I mean, there were some countries that were what I would call your historical abusers, right? Those were the ones that had legislative pronouncements like the ones you mentioned. These people, we don't recognize them as citizens. They don't get certain jobs or benefits, from the government. States, what I call state-sponsored persecution, right? That's the old-fashioned brand of religious suppression, right? Then you had this sort of other brand, which was what I would call exportation of extremist ideology, what you see a lot out of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So trying to sort of inculcate the wrong values in other countries. Those are problems that are very much the result of bad legislatures, bad parliaments, bad executives. The third problem was the one that was most on the rise when I was on the commission, and that was impunity, and it was especially a problem in Pakistan, where basically the state would just stand by and watch vigilantes persecute religious minorities, and nothing would be done about it. Those are all problems that at the end of the day really aren't going to get solved simply by having the right courts. If you don't have political leadership that helps to sort of create the right social and cultural conditions, you're going to be lost. So, in the United States right now, the courts are really at the center of it. Legislatures from time to time have stepped in, RFRA being a very good example, where I think there were enough people in political society that thought the court kind of got it wrong, and so the legislature stepped in. But we should be mindful of the fact that if religious harmony and radical secularism really continue to become more serious problems in our country, the court's not going to be where the remedies are going to exist. We're going to have political institutions stepping in and doing the right thing, or we're going to see some really serious problems that this country to date has not seen.
While I have you there, keep the microphone on. I wanted to ask you about efforts to pack the courts. This is an issue that is not old, it's not new, but it's something that's come to light just recently. Walk us through what that is and how packing courts could impact religious liberty down the road.
Well, court packing refers to this idea that when you're not happy with the majority of our U.S. Supreme Court, you just throw some more people on it, hoping that you can change the balance of power on the court.
Do you need a constitutional amendment for it?
You don't. That's the interesting thing. There's only really been one other instance in American history where this idea got serious attention, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. He dangled the suggestion. It ended up not having to go very far along because one of the justices on the court started voting in the president's direction. It was called the switch in time that saved 9. And so we really weren't confronted with a serious all-out legislative battle over court packing. There are a number of politicians these days who are promoting this and promoting it very seriously. What would that do to the courts and to the freedom of religion in particular? Well, I think part of the reason why people are proposing this is because they're not happy with the Supreme Court's recent trajectory on the freedom of religion. They're not happy with a Supreme Court that has been much more muscular in defending the rights of conscience. They see down the road a number of very crucial issues that have not yet been resolved by the courts. For example, Blaine amendments, which some of you may be familiar with, this idea that you can discriminate against religiously affiliated educational institutions and not provide them with the aid and accommodation you might provide secular educational institutions. They see cases like that. They see other conscience rights cases that relate to things like human sexuality still coming down the pike, and they figure by throwing 2 or 3 extra people on the court, they can tilt those decisions in a different direction. So we should, I think, be concerned both for rule of law reasons, right? It's just a bad idea to think about a court as a place where you can throw these bargaining chips around. And we should also be concerned because I think this is motivated in part by an animus toward what the freedom of religion really means under our First Amendment, among other values.
Thank you. Professor Scharffs, how do we find ways to depoliticize religious freedom? For example, a generation ago, this was an issue that received broad bipartisan support. Seems as though today both parties are divided. Some are skeptical, some might be overboard, and it seems that we need to strike that balance. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks. If you don't mind, I want to just make a brief comment to something that Rabbi Zippel said, and then I'll try to answer your question. I really like your invitation to look inwards first, and using Kyle Korver as an example of that. A few years back, I was at the United Nations, and there was a speaker on a panel who was an imam, and he said that there's a story of an ambitious religious leader who said that when he was 20, what he wanted to do was change the world. And by the time he was 30, he had modified his ambition to change his country. And by the time he was 40, it was his community. And when he was 50, it was his family. And that when he turned 60, his hope was to change himself. And I'm sort of approaching that stage in life where maybe I'll start thinking about looking in the mirror and starting there. And I like that instinct a lot because we see all kinds of problems when we look outwards. And some of it must start within each of our own hearts for these problems to be as endemic and as systematic as they are. And Pamela, I really loved your discussion of your experience working with the homeless and tying that to the concept of dignity. I was at a conference in India earlier this year, and I met a minister of the Anglican faith who has a ministry in Bangalore focusing on the poorest of the poor, and he's had people write doctoral dissertations about it, and the title of the dissertation was A Ministry of Dignity. And he liked this emphasis that we were trying to place on dignity. And I asked him a question. I said, is your ministry one of trying to restore people's dignity or getting them to recognize their dignity? And this is an old lawyer's trick that he didn't fall for. He said, of course it's both. He wouldn't answer the either or question. He said, for many of these children, having a clean toilet and a sink is a necessary precondition for them to be able to see that they are people who have dignity. And then after that has been restored, they can then come to recognize the dignity that they have. On the question of institutional protection of religious freedom, to me, what's most interesting about the last 40-year history of the United States with respect to religious freedom is how often the courts have failed to protect religious freedom and how often Congress has been willing to. RFRA, after all, was a response to a Supreme Court decision that failed to protect religious freedom of Native Americans. And this goes contrary to political science theory of why we have judicial review. Judicial review is supposed to be because the Senate, Congress are majoritarian institutions that will protect majorities but not minorities, and so we need courts to step in and protect minorities. But it wasn't courts that protected the minority. It was the Senate, and it was the majoritarian institution. And they also passed another law, the Native Americans Religious Freedom Act, which specifically addressed the question of the sacramental use of peyote. And then the Supreme Court struck down RFRA as it applied to the states, and it was once again Congress that stepped in with the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which tried to do as much as possible from the federal level to protect religious freedom. And it was states that stepped in and passed religious freedom acts. What's remarkable is that when Senator Hatch passed RFRA, it was almost unanimous. What was the final vote, Senator Hatch? 97-3, or 96-3. There might have been one person who was sick. That's amazing, right? And then who signed it? Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton was president, who signed it happily and took credit for it. But you know who else took credit for it? The ACLU, the NAACP, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, all of whom now stand opposed to RFRA because of the conflict between religious freedom and gay rights, largely. It's not just that, but it's largely that. And this gets to the question that you asked me, which is, how do we depoliticize this issue? This, more than anything else, worries me about the status of religious freedom in America today. It is a partisan issue. If you ask Democrats, as between gay rights and religious freedom, which should prevail, the vast majority say gay rights. If you ask Republicans, in a conflict between gay rights and religious freedom, which should prevail, the majority, in both cases, it's like a 75% majority, will give the opposite answer and will say religious freedom. Religious freedom was not a partisan issue when the International Religious Freedom Act was passed, when RFRA was passed, when RLUIPA was passed. It is a partisan issue today. And unless we address finding a principled pluralism that vindicates both gay rights and religious rights, we're going to be in a world of hurt in our country. And it's why efforts like Fairness for All, which Elder Gerard mentioned, why this idea of human dignity for everyone, everywhere, is so important, because we've got to sit down and each care about each other's fears and freedoms and not just our own fears and freedoms. Because one thing that really marks our moment is fear. And I think it's everywhere. I think that the gay rights community has legitimate basis for fear. I think the religious communities have legitimate basis for fear. The sick and tireds and the left behinds, that's the coalition that I think elected President Trump, have reason for fear. And, you know, we've got to find ways to seek solutions that are responsive to the fears, the needs, and the rights of everyone.
Thank you for that, Baroness.
Don't you think you need the Queen?
Of course.
We need all the help we can get. We need all the help we can get, and I'm happy to have the Queen's help at any time on any occasion. She's actually been a conspicuous proponent of religious freedom and of the importance of religion in not just public life, but life. And so I think that the example that she has shown personally, Charles, maybe not so much, but the Queen, I think, has actually been quite exemplary on this question.
Thank you for that. Let's have that our final word, the Queen. And thank you for all of you who participated on the panel. We've been deeply enriched and blessed in hearing your words, and I know that I can speak for all of us here. We've learned that we need to be serving others and a part of the community. Scott Anderson and I are the only ones standing between you and your box lunch, so I'm going to turn the time over to Scott Anderson.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and our speakers for this most engaging and interesting day. And as a token of our appreciation for your participation, we have this gift for you from O.C. Tanner. It's a world globe because this is a topic that's important across the globe. And we appreciate it. We appreciate your advice and your counsel. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed today's activity. As you go, as Matt said, we have a box lunch for you that you can take. There are also on the tables, both out this store and this store, pamphlets of Amar Foundation, and there is this booklet that we've reprinted for you. This has 8 speeches that the senator gave on religious freedom in the Senate, and they are remarkable. And I'd just like to read a quote from one of them on the importance of this. He said, religious liberty is fundamental. Freedom of conscience deserves preeminence because it goes to the very heart of who we are as human beings and how we make sense of our world. It implicates duties that transcend mere personal choice and become obligatory in the life of the believer. So please pick up one of these books. I think you'll enjoy these speeches, and Senator, we appreciate your vision and leadership in this area. But I want you to know that the Hatch Center, will be transcribing what you've heard today, making comments on it, and issuing a white paper that we can send out to you, and that I think you'll enjoy, and remind you of the wisdom that was shared with us during this conference. But again, to our speakers and to the panel, thank you very much, and to the Senator, thank you very much. I also want to thank the staff of the Hatch Center, especially Sarah and Matt, for all the work they've done in putting this together. Thank you very much. And thank you for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks.